perennials, and some of them look like they might be dividing. They're getting pretty enthusiastic. What good information can you share with us about how we should do that, how to do it right, and how to make sure our plants live at the end of it?
Thanks, Caitlin. Again, I'm Kathleen with Fairfax County Master Gardeners, and I'd like to talk with you about a way to take care of your plants that sounds like work, but there are many good reasons to do it, and that is to divide them. This is the time of year that your garden can look kind of bedraggled, overgrown, crowded with plants, and especially if you are growing perennials. They may be looking a bit worn out from their spring and summer season of blooming. So this is a good time of year to think about giving your plants a little more attention and look at dividing your perennials in the garden, whether they're growing in the soil or whether you have them in containers. That can apply to either growing situation. Next slide, please. So why should you divide your perennials? Here are some good reasons. Dividing them helps to control the size of your plants. They can easily get too large for the space that they've been allocated in your garden, and they can compete with other plants for space and nutrients. They can also be casting shade on other plants that might be needing that sun that they had earlier in their lives. Also, you can keep your plants healthier by cutting out material that is damaged, overgrown, or dead. And you can examine your plants and see, does it need some trimming back by this method? Dividing also rejuvenates your plants. It can lead to new growth and new blooming or more vigorous blooming. And then one of the most attractive aspects of dividing your perennials is you have more plants. You can use them to fill in other areas of your garden or create new garden beds or share them with friends, neighbors, community gardens, etc. So the hosta in this photo has lived on my deck for many years. And during that time, I've divided it numerous times to create 6 new hostas over the years. And these new hostas have become foundation plantings for my deck. The original hosta never seemed to notice or mind that it was being divided. It happened with very little disruption, and this plant has stayed healthy and relatively under control. And right this minute, it needs to be divided again, but I'll do that later. Next slide, please. So as you're thinking about dividing your perennials, what plants should be divided? And that takes some judgment, but there are also some clues to that. And if a plant is showing signs of these particular signs, it may be time to divide it. Maybe the growth isn't as vigorous as it used to be. Maybe the foliage isn't as thick as it could be. It's getting leggy, a little spindly. It may have a bare spot in the center where the plant material looks like it's dead or dying. Maybe the plant has gotten too large for the space that you have it in. Sometimes the blooms will get smaller or less abundant. For example, irises may get overcrowded in their spot, and you may see fewer blooms from those plants. And then another indicator is you're thinking about maybe moving your plant to a new location, maybe trying it in another spot in your garden. And that becomes a desirable aspect of dividing and trying out a new location. Next slide, please. So some specific plants lend themselves to being split into separate parts and rejuvenated. One of those is the common daylilies. They are easily divided without too much effort, and they will do well to be divided every few years, maybe 4 years or so. Some cultivars are slower growing, so they could maybe wait longer than 4 years or so. Another one, as I mentioned, is Hostas. They can be a little bit tougher to actually divide, but it can be well worth it in making the most of your plant and creating new ones. Other plants that divide well are coneflowers or echinacea, black-eyed Susans in the Rudbeckia group, and iris varieties. You can also try phlox. That does pretty well in my experience, and other perennials similar to those. Some plants that should not be divided, according to the research I did, include butterfly weed, euphorbias, oriental poppies, Japanese anemones, and false indigo. Most woody plants don't really adapt well to this method. And of course, you don't want to divide plants that are in the process of flowering. You want to wait until they finish flowering. They're done with that, and then it's time to divide them. Next slide, please. So more about when plants should be divided. Some plants do require dividing more than other plants to keep themselves healthy. Some do not want or need to be divided, and many can be divided every 3 or 4 years or sooner if you want new plants faster. Some plants can wait 10 years. On the other hand, vigorously growing plants such as chrysanthemum and aster may need division every year or two, depending on how quickly they're growing and how well they're doing. As I mentioned, don't divide them when they're flowering, and that's because they need to put their energy into developing their leaves and roots. They won't have an abundance of those when they've been divided, so they need to develop those so they can get established again. So in terms of timing by season, within the next few weeks, you will want to divide and replant the perennials that bloom in the summertime. So for summer blooming plants, if you are planting summer blooming perennials, divide and replant those in the fall. That's going to be coming up fairly quickly. You'll want to give them 6 weeks in the ground before the ground freezes to get established in their new planting area. So the average date of first frost around here is in early November, generally, maybe as late as November 15th. So you want to sort of back time your dividing and replanting according to that general time frame. Daylilies may often be divided in the spring or fall, but they are so resilient that they may hold up to be divided anytime. So it's not quite as urgent for those. The plants that are divided now and established this fall, they have 3 seasons to develop their root systems before the next hot summer that they have to endure. So that is good timing. You may be waiting now for your coneflowers to finish blooming, as I am in my garden, and those do well to be divided in the fall. So you might want to just watch the timing for those. Now for fall blooming plants, these can be divided in the spring and then given time to establish over that late spring and summer time frame before the next fall. For spring blooming plants, these can be divided late in the spring after they are done flowering, and then anytime. Just don't let them get overheated as it gets into late spring and early summer. Next slide, please. So how is it best to divide perennials? And it takes some preparation, a little planning ahead. You want to soak the ground a day or two before doing the dividing. And you want to be preparing the new planting site in advance so the perennials can be replanted quickly and to avoid their roots drying out. If you can, if it's possible, do the dividing on a cool, cloudy day to avoid overstressing the plants by placing them in the heat or the dry conditions. You'll want to gather up your tools for this project. You'll need a tool to do the dividing. It could be a spade, shovel, garden knife, or garden fork, depending on the size of the plant. Also, you might want to have on hand garden clippers for trimming. It's a good idea to trim foliage back to 6 or 8 inches from the ground. Then insert the tool around the plant, about 6 inches out from the base generally, but again, depending on the size of the plant, you may want to go out as far as the drip line, which is where the end of the leaves would generally be. Focus on the area you want to divide. Look for an area that has some shoots that look like they could be reasonably separated from the main plant, and then begin to loosen the root area. Next slide, please. So after you've begun loosening the roots, gently dig in and remove the portion to be divided and try to keep it intact. Keep a portion of the crown of the plant, which is the growing point, our main growing area, and keep a portion of the root system as part of the division. Spray that clump with water to help loosen soil and remove the soil. And as you are gently tugging this clump away from the main plant, you may need to use 2 tools to pull the portions of the plant apart and try to insert those and pull as gently as you can. Some plants may develop small side plants alongside the main plant that can be easily separated by a small tool or by hand. And that's the easy case. A little bit tougher is if a plant has a taproot, you might need to divide that with a sharp tool, keeping part of the taproot and some side roots on the part of the plant to be separated. If a plant has tubers or rhizomes, those can be separated with a sharp tool. Just look for a logical place to do that. And then once you've cut that portion of the plant off, check the roots, rhizomes, or tubers for any signs of disease or rot or damage. Trim off any damaged roots and discard the affected areas. Don't compost them. You want to get rid of those affected areas. Next slide, please. So now you've got fresh new plants and you want to replant them. First, a note, as a gardener, you may find the process of dividing plants more traumatic for you than it is for the perennial. But you have an opportunity to give it a good treatment and a safe new spot in your garden. Keep the new division moist and shaded as you're getting ready to replant it. Again, to keep the stress level down on that portion of the plant that no longer has that bigger root mass. Prepare the new site before doing the planting. You'll want to amend the soil, probably with compost, for healthier plants and good growth. Water them generously for the next few weeks, maybe 2 or 3 weeks. And then you can apply a layer of mulch, not too thick, just as they're getting established. And then it's recommended that you wait to fertilize them the following year or a couple of seasons after they've gotten more established. Next slide. So here are some resources for dividing perennials. And I want to note that fairfaxgardening.org has a wealth of resources for gardeners on many subjects. I also want to note that there's a reference here to the University of Illinois Extension, which was a good resource for this topic. But I do want to note, if you go to that source or others in that region, please note that that's a different growing zone. Illinois is zones 5 and 6 generally. So you'll want to adapt to our region from their advice. So are there any questions?
Yes, we have a couple of questions. Can you explain what a taproot is, Kathleen?
Basically, it's the main root coming down from the plant. Some of them have rather than dispersed smaller roots, they may have a main root that's going a little bit deeper. And there may be side roots off of that. And if anyone else wants to embellish on that, please feel free.
I always think of it, a carrot as a taproot, or a dandelion is one that you see a lot. So a taproot is a long, deep central root with smaller ones coming off the side rather than, as Kathleen said, like a dispersed root system.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of talking with my hands to describe that, but.
I have another question, and I may have missed the answer to this. When is the best time to divide hostas? And the reason I ask that is because we generally wait until the plants have stopped flowering to the division, and later in the season, more toward fall, hostas get the flowers. So what kind of category do they fall into for dividing?
I'll just tell you my own experience, and I have hostas that are blooming right now, but they generally bloom for a couple of weeks. And then after that, I would look at dividing them. And just in my experience, I've divided them early fall and replanted, and then had success with them coming up the next spring. And, maybe not as vigorously as the more established ones, but they will come back. And I generally do trim some of the foliage off as well when replanting them.
Had a similar question about the bulbs. And the bulbs we talk about after they've stopped flowering, according to the presentation, that's the right time to plant. You also, or replant. You also talked about maybe trimming the foliage back a little bit. Does that, because I know that the bulbs do rely on that foliage for additional energy to put out flowers for the next season. So how does that affect their ability to do that?
This is a very good point. And research I've done and experience I have with bulbs is that you do want them to keep their foliage until that foliage turns yellow or brown. As long as it's green, you do want to keep it. So in the case of, say, daffodils, for example, they've finished blooming, but you want to divide them up. I would just wait until they've finished with their foliage, and then they have stored the food and nutrients they need for blooming the following year. And then I would, it just takes a few weeks, and then I would divide them at that point. And I'd follow the same idea with other bulbs as well, spring blooming bulbs.
Okay. Thank you, Kathleen. And I think one thing too is when we're dividing things such as grasses or hostas and that kind of leafy plant, we kind of have to put up with a kind of a not so attractive beginning. You may have it sort of chopped off in one side, and it takes some time to fit in.
Right. It's not going to be beautiful when you replant it. It's going to be a work in progress, kind of like a delinquent youth You're just going to have patience and let it come back. And generally the next season, it will start to fill in a little bit more and look a little less disreputable. So it won't be, chances are, it won't be beautiful right away.
Great, thank you.
But it will be worth it. And especially when it comes to hostas, you are going to save a lot of money by creating your own.
Yes, they are not cheap to buy.
No.
Be happy if you give them some also. We didn't have any more questions. Anybody else who hasn't posted one in the chat box?
Kathleen, I had a couple questions that I thought of as I was listening to your presentation. It was really informative. But for some of our beginners who kind of along Kathy's question about tap roots, you mentioned not dividing woody plants. So if I'm a beginner gardener, I don't know what a woody plant is. How do we tell them apart from perennials that I could possibly divide?
I believe that refers more to shrubs, generally bigger plants than we think of with perennials. Perennials tend to have more tender shoots, tender foliage, and then the woody plants, it's a little bit tougher to get into those. So I think that's a different category of propagation.
I think too, you're also going to see some bark, some actual bark on the woody plants that indicate that that's a woody perennial, such as an azalea or
right,
the other type plants in that category.
And they also wouldn't die back to the, like woody plants keep their structure seasonally, right?
Right. You may want to maintain that structure and maybe manage that by trimming back carefully, not too radically. Whereas a perennial, I think you have a little more leeway with the shape of that plant and with the extent to which you're going to divide off of it.
Great. And then I had one other kind of, you mentioned this, and it's kind of a different subject, but you mentioned growing perennials in containers that you have the hosta on your deck that you've divided a couple years in a row. Do you have any tips for growing perennials in containers? Is it any different than growing them in the ground?
I think you have to watch the water level, certainly, and that's kind of almost a common sense one. And certainly lately, we haven't had to be concerned with water levels, but sometimes during the summer, you have to watch and see that they do stay watered well enough. So that's one thing. And you may also want to give them a little bit of nutrient boost or, make sure that soil is in good shape, that it's got a good mix of materials in it. But I think that the main thing is the water, because they can dry out more easily in a container than they would in the general ground area of your garden.
Great.
A bonus to container gardening is that it's possible to move containers to get the sun that you want. And some people do that with tomatoes, for example. You can put them on the little rack that has the wheels or casters on it, and you can follow the sun with those. So there are advantages to container gardening.
That sounds like another good topic for one of our classes.
Definitely. There's a lot to it.
Yeah, and I think for a lot of us who might have small spaces and might feel like, I don't have room for a garden, or I can't grow that because, I can't grow a perennial because I don't have a yard. Like, that's a really good point. That's not a disqualification. Kathy, do you have any other questions or I'm sorry, Kathleen.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say that for people inclined to have something that they can eat that's easy to grow and keep in containers, maybe try some herbs, which do require a lot of sun. They also can be divided, just like flowering perennials. I have herbs in my garden that came from neighbors dividing theirs. And as long as you have enough sun to keep them happy, you should get a good result from them, even in containers.
And will they overwinter, Kathleen?
That depends. Basil will not, in my experience anyway. Some people are able to create an environment for rosemary that allows those to overwinter. I haven't had luck with that, but I know other people who do have luck with that in this region. Thyme and chives are brilliant for overwintering here in this area. Chives especially, it's the first thing up in the spring in my garden, and they go right on to November, and then I have an abundance to harvest and keep over the winter. So in my opinion, the best money I ever spent in the garden was on a couple of chives.
And we know that mint is very hardy, and that will overwinter as well. It may die back a little bit and may look a little rough in the winter, but it will come back in the spring as well.
Yes, and I think that's another good one to keep in a container because it could take over your garden if you let it loose.
Exactly.
Very prolific.
Yes.